Welcome back to The Perspective, episode 6, and events are getting increasingly serious for the future of football in this country. First of all, before I introduce our guests, I would like to express sympathy, all of our sympathy, for the police officers who were injured in the demonstrations at Old Trafford. No cause is worth injury to the people who are charged with keeping society safe. That said, that first and foremost said, the cause with which the vast majority of those fans had gone very legitimately, more than legitimately, to propagate, well, we all know what it was, the consequences of the so-called European, so-called super, so-called league, which for the moment is, thank God, dead. But first of all, I would, before we go any further, like to say that instead of the millionaire pundits who've been lecturing us in the last 2 weeks, and to be fair, the likes of Gary Neville and Gary Lineker have been quite superb in leading this issue. We have people who can actually inform and help us, show us the way forward. Kit Holden is actually in Berlin. Now, there were lots of banners about 50+1. We all know vaguely what 50+1 means, and we were all in support of it. But Kit is actually in Berlin. He's an expert journalist writing about German football. And welcome to The Perspective, Kit.
Thanks. Nice to be here. Cheers, buddy.
It's our pleasure. We also have Kevin Miles, who is the chief executive of the Football Supporters Association, and thus the man who is in charge of representing all supporters. And I think we're all very conscious that unity is fundamental in the campaign to get proper supporter representation that we're now fighting. Kevin, a very, very warm welcome to you.
Thanks very much for the invitation to take part, Paddy.
Well, it's a pleasure. It's probably not the most highfalutin meeting that you've been to lately, because Kevin, as the boss of the Football Supporters Association, was very much on the guest list at the Downing Street meeting, where the Prime Minister encompassed the cause that we're all talking about. What was your impression, Kevin, about how strongly he is behind the fans' campaign?
Well, I wouldn't say that was more highfalutin than taking part here, Paddy, because I mean it's one thing to get an insight into a conference chamber at number 10, but to get a glimpse of Paddy Bartley's kitchen is not offered to many.
Hey, and I pay for my own kitchen as well.
Yeah, you can tell. No, I mean, it was a little bit of a surreal experience, I must admit. The whole thing, that 72-hour war to the death over the European Super League, and the meeting with the Prime Minister was. I actually had a meeting with the Minister of Sport the day before, at which they were discussing then their preparations to announce the fan-led review of the governance of football, which was obviously announced on the Monday tea time. We met with them with the Prime Minister on the Tuesday morning, so that was already part of the firmament, part of the fixes that had announced this review. And it was, well, actually, the elephant in the room was addressed by the Prime Minister himself in his opening sentences, because he basically said, he referred to some mickey taking he'd had from some of his own backbenchers about the fairly glaring irony that here is a dyed-in-the-wool free market conservative, proposing state intervention, government intervention into the affairs of a sport and interfering with how the free market was playing itself out in that particular game. and he was right. That was a glaring irony, but he justified it by saying right from the start of the meeting, he said, however, part of the role of government is to defend the culture of the country, the national institutions, the fabric of society, and what goes to make it. And football clearly has a particular role. And I found the Prime Minister repeating back points that the FSA have been making for years about football not being an ordinary business, about its position in the communities, in the lives of people, in the fabric of the culture and the history of the country, making it different. And he referred to the owners of football clubs as custodians of them. These aren't their private playthings. They look after them, and they have ownership, titular ownership of them. They can put money in and out of them, but they are ultimately short-term custodians of big institutions which will outlive them. And that was actually quite heartening and slightly bemusing to hear all of that coming from the Prime Minister. But you got the impression, and look, a cynic will say that the Prime Minister's newfound interest in this has a lot to do with their relatively recent electoral success in some of the old traditional
red wall.
Yes, this so-called red wall, about the need to appeal and to maintain an appeal with the electorate in those areas. And this was an easy way of doing it. A cynic will say it's short term and for electoral advantage. Quite frankly, I don't care as long as it has the effect of doing something decisive to precisely to protect the fabric of the sport, the strength of the pyramid, and to do something about it. And it looks at the moment as though the government is set on a course of really trying to do something fundamental. I'm sorry about that. My phone is just rumbling.
That's okay.
That's
we
fine.
know you're a busy boy. We know you're a busy boy.
I'll kill it.
Well, while Kevin's doing that, Kate, you're more yellow wall than red wall. And as an expert on German football, and one of the, obviously the 50+1 has become a sort of almost a cliche. Thank you, Kevin. Before we bring Kevin back, and we're also, by the way, going to hear from Omar in a bit, because Omar was at the demonstration at Old Trafford, which caused the postponement of the Manchester United-Liverpool game, that red wall came down pretty quickly. But Kit, do you think that the atmosphere at German stadiums, that the atmosphere around German football, means that British fans would be, of which you are also one, would be wise to adopt that model, or as close to it as they can get?
Well, I think, firstly, you say I'm more yellow wall than red wall. I'll have to disagree, because actually the club I support and follow is Union Berlin, so I'm very much red wall. And I think certainly the German model is, as a lot of English supporters have been saying for a long time, and increasingly English pundits are saying, is a good model to sort of have as something to aspire to, or something to kind of work on. Whether or not it's entirely transferable, I don't know. What it certainly does do is gives fans the feeling that they have a voice, not just in the sort of broader debates like the Super League, but also in the day-to-day of how their club is run and what their club does, the sponsorship deals it takes on, things like that. And I think that's fundamentally a good thing. And it's also something that German football is quite proud of. I mean, there is a debate about whether it weakens German football's competitiveness in the Champions League and things like that. And I think the protests in England at the moment are quite encouraging to people who have always supported 50+1 in Germany, because they feel if this is something, if 50+1 or something similar can spread across Europe, then suddenly that argument that you've got in Germany to get rid of it because it's bad for competition is gone, and so it's protected much more than it was.
Yeah, I mean, as one of those who believes that the ultra capitalism, which has seen English football totally dominate Europe this season in a way that I'm very uneasy about, much as it's nice on an individual level. I think it'd be nice to have some what you might call leveling down to the German model, but I'm being biased. Before we bring Kevin in on how this sort of 50+1 can be applied to English football. Omar, you were at the demonstration at Old Trafford?
Yeah.
Did you get the feeling that this is that the people there want what we are talking about?
I mean, it was an interesting one being at the protest because everybody, colluded together for this main narrative and how that they wanted the Glazers out. It was a protest against the Glazers. That was the main fundamental issue. And if you do your research behind it, it's understandable why the supporters of Manchester United were protesting against this regime, because they've taken almost £1 billion out of the club. And you see with other clubs, such as in the so-called Big Six, such as Manchester City, the owners were the ones invested in the team. The revenue created from, the success of that football club was put into, improving the squad. And I think with the Glazers, I think as I said, they've taken about £1 billion out in dividends. That the club, before they took over in 2005, was debt free. Now that I think the debt is up to £455 million. So it's understandable why we saw some of the scenes that we did at Old Trafford. Some of them were violent, don't get me wrong. I mean, when I was in there, I got there at about 3 p.m. and the majority of people were protesting peacefully. And I spoke to James Cooper of Sky Sports, and he said that the people were in there, that most of them were protesting freely, but apparently the scenes at the Lowry were much worse because they blocked off the whole entire team. Unfortunately, I wasn't at the Lowry Hotel, but I completely agree in that I thought the protest was absolutely necessary, because if you take it from a fan perspective, what more could they do if the owners weren't listening to them? I think the Glazer family have only had one interview with Manchester United TV, and since they took over the club. So I just don't see what else a supporter could do in terms of, getting it out there, because it's clear that, I mean, people may go to social media, for example, but I don't think the football clubs really take notice of the social media fandom, as we've seen with the social media boycott as well, which has been a very positive thing. But I agree that the protest was absolutely necessary. Do I think that there should be more protests? I don't think they could be as effective, because I think the police and the authorities would be much more prepared and organized for something if something similar did happen again. So I think the best way to protest would be to hit these owners financially, which would be don't go to the football matches, don't buy the merchandise. And I think those would be more transformative in seeing a change at the clubs.
Yeah, it is fair to say that we have other more powerful ways actually of hitting these owners, and that also that the demonstration at Chelsea about 10 days ago was very peaceful and very effective indeed. Kevin, how important is that we stick together? Okay, United fans are a special case because of their hideous ownership model, but as we saw 2.5 weeks ago, they're all in this together. These the shameful six. How important is it, before we go on to the 50+1, that all fans stick together on this one, even ones who like their owners, like Manchester City, really?
Well, I think on the example of the European Super League, you have 6 owners who are clearly prioritizing their own financial self-interest over the structures of the game.
Yes.
So there's 6 bad owners, and then regardless of the quality of all of the other owners, they would be victims of the machinations of the 6, because right down the pyramid, the impact of a European Super League will be felt. It's clearly designed, apart from anything else, to hoover up revenues for the isolated, cocooned group of people who are permanently guaranteed a place in that league in perpetuity, and it's to hoover up revenues that could otherwise have gone elsewhere in the game. And for all the critique of the Premier League, and I've been clearly for a long time among those who have been very critical of the financial model of the Premier League.
Yeah.
The Premier League does and has filtered some of that money down in terms of solidarity down to the rest of the game. Now, for me, it's nowhere near enough, and I don't particularly like the soft power control that goes with it that the Premier League used to get their way on a lot of other things. However, there is a distribution of that sort of work. That would be cut off. And there are a whole number, probably 20 at least, Football League clubs, the difference for whom between life and death financially is determined by the solidarity money that they get cascaded down from the Premier League. They wouldn't be able to manage in their model at the moment. It's ridiculous that we have a situation where there is more money in football globally than there ever has been before, and yet we still have the problem at grassroots level where facilities are really poor. That there's real difficulties in maintaining just the hierarchy and the ecosystem of the structure right the way down to the pyramid. It's crazy, and that's because of the way the game is running. It's concentrated. So there's everybody who cares about the pyramid, and I think that's something that football fans in England are brought up with, the fact that you're part of a family that goes right from kids playing football at school through junior football, through Sunday league football, through the pyramid, right through the non-league game, all the way through. The idea that in theory you could progress from the bottom right up to the top, but there's somehow you're all part of the same sport that all fits and meshes together somewhere. That was and remains at risk. And therefore, everybody has an interest in doing something about it. Now, what that looks like, the interest that you have in it and what you're particularly looking for your club will depend on your owner. It'll depend on the level you're competing at. It'll depend on what the economics of your own setup is. But the one thing the ESL has done, I think, is it has united not only the rest of football, but huge chunks of the supporter base of those clubs themselves against one particular mission. It's had quite a unifying effect. And the other thing it's done is I think it's put issues about the ownership and governance of the game and onto the agenda in a way that it never has been before. It's brought it right to the front of the agenda for even the politicians. And it has almost cemented the idea, which I've felt for a while now, but I think a lot of people are now coming to realize this, even the football authorities are coming to realize this, is that football cannot be relied upon any longer to regulate itself, because the structures of the authorities in football are themselves too governed and too dominated by these big financial interests. And even the football authorities, I think, now need help from outside. It was quite striking if you saw the statement from the Premier League yesterday.
Yeah.
The Premier League statement said that they will be enlisting the help of government to legislate to prevent this happening again. When have you ever heard the Premier League or the FA use similar language talking about enlisting the help of government, not just tolerating government interest, but enlisting the help of government to legislate to defend the sport? And I mean, for me, that's a very different situation from what we had before.
If we don't end up with a regulator after this, I will feel utterly distraught. I'll feel. I don't know how I'll feel. Sorry, Omar.
Just quickly, Kevin. Are you, in your opinion, are you somewhat concerned that this may return this proposed idea of the European Super League? Because we've had threats from Florentino Perez, for example, saying it's not over. We just need to work on our PR, for example. We need to work on the promotion and relegation side of things.
A few tweaks.
Yeah. So what's your opinion? Are you concerned that something like this may crop up again in the near distant future?
I think I'll go a little bit further, to be honest. I would say that unless something is done which is unbreakable in terms of independent regulation and legislation and government intervention into this, it is absolutely inevitable that this will resurface in another form. Because what we're looking at here is it's a natural consequence of the trajectory the football has been on over the last 20 or 30 years, with a bigger and bigger concentration of money at the top, which has then inspired more and more international global interest without any commitment to the traditions and their background of the sport, the spotting an opportunity for wealth generation for themselves. Let's get this right. I'm not bothered what nationality a billionaire is who sets out to destroy our game, but I don't think it's coincidence that a lot of this is rooted in American capital. But a different approach to these things. That's the trajectory that we've been on, and what we found is because the football authorities 30 years ago, this isn't just a question of wanting to be proved right after the event, they set in train and they enable, with the creation of the Premier League and the whole dynamic they've developed around that, they set in train a direction of travel which has led us inevitably to do this. And they have found it. It's like a cuckoo in the nest, that these big six have outgrown the ability of the football authorities to contain them and to regulate them within their own family. And that's why they have come around to the idea that even the football authorities need help in sorting this out, because these cuckoos have grown into vultures now. I know that's not particularly ornithologically accurate as a
yes, but we are living in strange times. Kit, I mean, could a nightmare like this, for which at least we've woken up from the nightmare. We don't know, as Kevin has pointed out, whether if we, and I'll try and keep my metaphors straight, my metaphorical ducks in a row. We know that if we go to sleep again, the nightmare could return. Could it happen in Germany, Kit?
The clubs would join the Super League, you mean?
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to say it's impossible, because I think one of the kind of, I think you always have to see this in a broad European context. And if you look at the way 50+1 has, the effect it's had in the last few years, I mean, for 10 years or so in the 2000s, what it definitely also did was it made the Bundesliga quite even and quite competitive, and made small clubs able to challenge Bayern Munich. That's changed in the last 10 years. Partly because clubs like Bayern and Dortmund have had to find ways of getting more income to compete with the English clubs and the Spanish clubs as they get richer and richer. And so that's led to a situation where it's not entirely impossible that Bayern could, if they really wanted to, let's say, lobby their membership and basically say, look, it's either we join this thing or we're gone, and you don't win any more European titles. And then probably the membership would go with it. But the point is they would have to do that. The point is they couldn't overnight say, we're just joining this, because the backlash would be so even stronger and even more serious for those in charge of the club than Germany. It was in England.
Because, I mean, I've always not, it appears naively believed that Real Madrid and Barcelona were run by the socios, by their members. There don't seem to have been any riots in the Ramblas or the Castellana over this. The supporters who are supposedly in charge have just sort of appear, and perhaps I'm wrong, to have gone along with it. Have you any information on that, on whether there's been revolts among the Real and Barcelona fans?
I mean, I'm with you as well. I don't know. I'm not very clued in on how that socio system works in terms of the sort of democratic processes and whether they could do that. But I do think that the general culture in Germany is very much that these kind of debates were being had long before, a few weeks ago anyway. And there was the fan groups are very much on the kind of, I wouldn't say a perpetual war footing, but something close to it, in the sense they're always looking out for things like this and things that would break down, the structures they have there. So that's why clubs really, like Bayern, if they wanted to join it, they probably could, but they would have to really come up with a long-term strategy of how to convince their members.
Right. Kit, just quickly on the 50+1 model. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is it different with clubs like Union Berlin compared to Bayern Munich, for example? Because I've read something somewhere that the structure at Union means that the fans have more of a say in it compared to Bayern, for example. What's the situation with that? Is it different then?
So effectively, there are two ways of doing it. The classic way is the way that Union have, and a few other clubs, I think Schalke still have it, but there's fewer and fewer clubs that do have this more traditional way, which is it essentially works as a club, and you have members and they vote for the board, and it's pretty straightforward. What most big clubs, including Bayern, have done is that they've basically commercialize their first team, their men's first team, and the professional arm of the club. So that then exists as a kind of commercial body inside the broader structure of the club, which encompasses the youth teams and the women's teams and the members. That does, to a certain extent, it weakens the power that the membership has over certain decisions such as sponsorship or things like that. I mean, at Union, for example, there was a big uproar when they came up about the decision they made to have a property developer on their shirt. Ultimately, the fans didn't really want to, but also didn't to stop that happening. But there was enough of a backlash that was something to be taken seriously by the leadership. At Bayern, I mean, you can have the backlash, but essentially, over a decision like that, they have as little influence as a Premier League club would have. But in the broader issues, I mean, the club itself, the members still do have power, even when that arm is commercialized. So there's still that kind of check and balance on it.
Yeah, Kevin, I read somewhere that you felt that yes, we can have something like 50+1 in English football, but that we might have to, moderate it in an English to suit an English model. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think there are. I'm a huge admirer of the way that the German fan movement has protected and defended the game in Germany. And I'm obviously, I don't think it'd be a surprise to anybody. No, I'm a big advocate of fan ownership in clubs as well.
Me too.
But you start from where you are rather than where you wish you were. And I think that we have to, and I think, this contribution, Kit's contribution here, will actually be a really helpful part in that process. So we have to do a little bit of education around 50%+1 and what it actually means, because, I mean, one of the advocates of it, for instance, is Andy Burnham. And I don't know if anybody read Andy Burnham's piece. I think it was on the Thursday after the Super League had just died. He wrote a piece in The Guardian about it, and he had one paragraph in which he referred to 50+1, and it meant two different things in the same paragraph. Neither of them were really feasible. So I do think we have to do a bit of serious thinking about it. And the first point we have to get across, it's not 51% share ownership in a private company that operates in Germany. And that's one of the misconceptions that Andy Burnham, for instance, had. He said you should have the right to buy for shares for supporter groups up to the point where they have an automatic right to buy up to 51% of the shares of the company of the club. Now, even if that's what 50%+1 meant, it's not really viable at a Premier League club of the size of Manchester United. I mean, the one club that we have a price on currently that's up for sale, Newcastle United, is up for sale about 300 to 350 million quid. Why should Newcastle fans, apart from anything else, never mind could they, why should they be expected to generate 175 million pounds to buy half of the football club just to be able to guarantee its existence against being, stolen from the heart of the community and turned into an international, brand? I don't think that's realistic. The other thing I think we need to remember is that how we arrive at 50+1, in the case of the German clubs, every one of those clubs that's at 50+1 started off as 100% fan owned. You don't have the same. Well, that's not strictly true. There are one or two clubs who were always privately owned because they were, I think, Wolfsburg's one of them. I think Bayer Leverkusen. There were works football teams effectively. And even in the East, you saw teams that were the army team or a rail workers team or whatever else. But generally speaking, they start at 100%, and that grip of the supporters has been whittled away because the pressure has been of the commercialization and whatever else. And the fans have held the line at 50+1 so far. But there's already been chipping away at that. And I think Kit's right, exactly accurate in how he's portrayed it. Now, the question for you is, I don't think you're going to get the 50+1 share ownership. I don't think it's the most realistic way of doing it. I'd also think I used to always say that there are no examples of a financially successful and viable club going from private ownership to supporter ownership. Supporter ownership has either traditionally been either it's something that starts from the beginning, like the German clubs, or with the Phoenix clubs that they've been like Wimbledon or FC United, Manchester. Yeah, exactly. And others here. Or they have been something that has come about because a privately owned club has collapsed effectively. It's gone to administration. It's needed rescuing by the fans, and the fans have stepped into the rescue. And that's been the only route to supporter ownership. It's never come from a successfully private owned club that's still generating money, a going concern, turning into one. There is an exception to that now I'm aware of, which is Motherwell.
Yes.
But I think Motherwell serves the purpose of being the exception that proves the rule.
Yeah.
So it's in order to work out how we arrive, what the best model is, you do have to look at what's realistic in the English situation. So what we've been looking at is about, well, what is it that the 50+1 delivers for fans in Germany? And then what mechanisms are there to deliver that in England, in the UK? And when you're starting from a position of private ownership. And one of the ideas that we've come up with, which I think addresses this, is never mind what the size of the equity is that you own in the company. If you can create a company structure which includes a golden share, which you can, in other words, which is held by the supporters, and the supporter is happy with the need for a structure, a properly managed structure of democratic control over that. But if you've got a golden share, and there are a list of a number of things that like this happens in Germany, it doesn't mean in Germany that the fans pick the team, or that the fans decide who's next going to be signed for the club, or even, as Kit said, who the sponsors are going to be. A lot of that commercial element is still left to the owners, or if you like, of the club. But you can have a list of things that cannot be done without the approval of that golden shareholder. It doesn't matter what the equity is.
The golden shareholder has to go back to the fans and have a poll.
Yeah, you can have a democratic structure. And you can have, whether, I mean, the nearest you have to a ready-made model is a supporters trust, which is already regulated by the FCA, has strict rules about how they function. It has to be on the basis of one member, one vote. You have that similar sort of structure at every club. And you could have, it's then a question of what does the legislator or a regulator, or what to ascribe to the powers of that golden share. Now, there are some things that are already heading in that direction under FA rules. So you now can't change the colours that you're playing, or the name of your club, or the badge and stuff like that without the consent of the supporter base.
As in Hull.
Exactly.
Hull
Tigers.
Yeah.
So you could easily, in the current climate, it would be an absolute shoo-in to say that one of the things that would be added to that is which competitions you take part in, which leagues you want to join, etc. So that would be an obvious. But I think you could add into, and there's we're having some discussion around this, how extensive that list should be, because you want to get the balance about the clubs still being able to function efficiently and effectively, economically, take part in the modern world that we live in. But you want some things that the supporters have a control and a veto over. So it could be that the owner has to bring his business plan for the general approval of the general terms of business plan, and put the approval of the supporters on the basis of an annual or a 6-monthly basis. And the golden shareholders could veto it and say, no, actually, we don't like the fact you're stripping so much money out of the club. Refer it back, go back and think about that again. And you could work out what list applies to that.
So it could even apply, not just Super League plotters, it could apply to the Glazers.
It could apply anyway. If you build it into the structure, that's the requirement of ownership of a football club in the English pyramid. Now, in order to get that done, that would require legislation. And it would require some sort of independent regulation to make sure that clubs conform with that. So I think golden share in the ownership structure in a club level, combined with a regulatory authority which has parameters for what it wants to do in terms of the game. It looks at the national and global issues, but also has the authority to enforce those bits of legislation about how the clubs are run. And then in the middle between those two, you then have a much tighter and much more meaningful form of supporter engagement in the meantime. So there is at least dialogue with supporter bases about the whole of the trajectory of the club, about the ethos of the club, the ambitions of the club, how far you want to stretch, etc. And that sort of thing. And that needs to be meaningful. It needs to have access to all the financial information. You need to be talking to the top people at the club, not the PR reps. And you need to talk to decision makers. You need to have access, full transparency about the financial situation, the ownership, the debt, all of those sort of things. And I think you can have meaningful dialogue around that. And you've got the safety block at either end, at national level and the regulator, and at club level with the golden share, to make sure there are parameters beyond which an owner or investors cannot go. I think that's something like that sort of model gets you the benefits of the 50+1, whatever what the 51+1 delivers in Germany, without necessarily having to worry about raising the money to buy out an owner or or something like that. And I mean, the other reference that Andy Burnham made in the same article is that, well, until you get to 50+1 ownership, 51% share ownership, you have to have a 51% vote on the season ticket holders. Now, for me, that's not adequate either, because I mean, not everyone can afford a season ticket. It excludes a whole swathe of your own membership. It leaves the control of the electorate in the hands of the people who are issuing season tickets, in other words, the owners. So I think you need a different, that's not an adequate structure either. And that, I mean, Andy Burnham is a person who understands most of these issues and has a long-term commitment. I'm not doubting Andy Burnham's sincerity about these things at all. But for me, it illustrates the need to cut through some of the illusions around this sort of thing and drill down to what are you actually trying to achieve here in your regulation of the game.
Evan, have you had any indications really from anybody as to how easy it would be to implement this sort of legislation for this to actually happen?
Well, we do have, the government have set up this the
review,
this governance review.
Yeah,
and I would have thought that is prime territory for that review to be looking at ideas like this, but also to road test and to troubleshoot against all the potential pitfalls and to consult the experts. Government's in a unique position to do this work. They get the people who know about these things, because I mean, I have a limited experience of what a regulator is or how football finances work, etc. But you've got, government will have access to call as witnesses and to call evidence about these sort of things and say, look, tell us what could go wrong with this. What do we need to guard against? How could this best be implemented? So we have, I think, in this review, probably a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
Absolutely.
Because there's a conjuncture of people seeing the danger and a willingness to do something about it. Yeah. I think it's a real opportunity to be grabbed now.
And if the relationship with I certainly feel that the relationship between supporters, in particular organized supporters through the FSA, which has supporters, I think, of every league club and many more, among how many members of the FSA?
Well, it's a perpetual problem counting them all because they don't sit still. Put it this way: during the first day of the European Super League, we got an extra 10,000.
Yeah, well, that gives you an idea of, we are talking big figures.
We're definitely over 500,000, Paddy. So there's a
well, and should be more. In my opinion, the FSA is. We have to stay united. We're lucky enough in this country to have a great fans organization with, I think, membership's free, isn't it?
It is free membership.
With free membership. So everybody, please join the FSA and join the campaign. And before we go back to Kit, it's not a very nice point, this, but if we are going to keep this single hymn sheet between the fans and the government, regardless of what those fans might think of the government in other aspects of life, is it vital that we see only peaceful protest?
Look, on the Manchester United protest, I mean, look, I think it should be a given, right, that we don't condemn violence and criminality. In fact, if you think about it, it's such a banal thing to say. It probably doesn't need saying. That should be a given. That said, I think there were elements about the Manchester United protest which I think were particularly effective, even though I might have hesitated to say it in advance. So my understanding is from our contacts at Manchester United that they didn't break into the ground. Security guards opened the gates.
There's a video.
Now, actually, I thought, my personal opinion, I'm just speaking for nobody but myself here, but for me, television pictures of football fans inside a football ground reclaiming their territory and saying that this is a football ground, I thought that was actually quite a powerful image,
Very
particularly
powerful.
in the context.
If it's peaceful, I absolutely, I think
It's
was.
probably
It was
technically
a bit like
illegal, Paddy. It's technically
yes.
All right, it's a civil offence, trespass, isn't it? It's not a criminal offence.
Yes.
Whatever else.
It's not.
But it was powerful.
It should not be at all confused with assaulting a policeman, which is.
And the only caveat
completely.
I'd give to that as well is I saw the police statement about a police officer having his face slashed. Right? And it's very emotive language.
Yeah.
I would just urge a little bit of caution on all these things about let's wait and find out what the real situation is. Because what I also saw video footage of police officers beating a football supporter, 3 or 4 of the officers under one van, outside the crowd, hidden behind a police van, give them a good hiding. I remember the Sarah Everard protests when the first the first statements were made by the police. We talked about how many police officers had been hospitalised, and they talked about broken bones and all this sort of stuff. A subsequent statement revealed actually there weren't any broken bones. So let's let the dust settle and see what actually did. Now that's it. Look, the starting point is a condemnation of violence.
That's fair.
To get all political just for a moment, let's be clear. The policing bill, which is currently before Parliament, would outlaw peaceful protest outside a football ground. Never mind the violence and all that sort of stuff. A peaceful protest outside the football ground, like what happened at Chelsea. That Chelsea protest that you commended so strongly, Paddy, quite rightly, would be illegal under the terms of the new policing bill. So there's a threat to the idea of protest there, and I've got to defend, the right of fans to protest in the way that they know best. Now, engaging with a political process like a fan-led review, that's a bit of the sort of raison d'etre of a structured fans organisation. That's what we do, is what we're here for.
Yeah,
not everybody works on, involves in themselves and that sort of thing. And the passionate football fan whose experience of football is a means of letting off steam that they go to at the weekend, who feels that their way of life and their culture is threatened, they've got to have the opportunity and the right to be able to demonstrate that publicly and noisily.
100%.
And I mean, I hope they will also demonstrate it commercially, which it may even prove more effective. Kit, you've been silent for so long because we've been gaping open-mouthed at the wisdom of Kevin Miles. But how do you feel?
Good, yeah. I mean, one thing, Kevin called it a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, this review, and I completely agree. And as somebody who perhaps is slightly less inclined to trust this government, even when I agree with what it's saying on the surface of things, I'd add that I really feel what this needs, as well as action from the British government and national governments generally in other places, and as well as action from fan groups, is probably also action from UEFA. Because if you look at, I mean, to take a slightly different example, which is nonetheless similar, one thing in German football which has become gained more and more credence in the last 2 years is the idea of a salary cap. It used to be that it was only clubs like Union who were calling for it. Now you've got serious comments being made by the head of the DFL, the German Football League, saying that they would, they're inclined to that idea. The problem is that the league can't implement it because it would be a further disadvantage to its clubs in terms of European competition. And I wonder whether, for all the kind of the right noises are coming out now, whether ultimately the British government is going to be disinclined in the long run to really make it unattractive for investors to invest in these big football clubs, because these big football clubs are massive economic boons for the country, and there's also a reason for the government to protect the investors' interests as well as the fans' interests. So I wonder whether the only way of solving that kind of problem is for this idea of the European competitive disadvantage to be taken out of the equation. If UEFA impose the kinds of rules that Kevin is talking about on a European level, then the national governments, the national federations have a lot more freedom to impose rules that help fans.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Omar, we've run out of time, I'm afraid. We could talk about this for 100 years, but is there? Can you wind things up and summarize for us?
Yeah. I mean, I just want to say a massive thank you to both Kevin and Kit for coming on the show. We really appreciate it, and it's been one of my favorite, if not my favorite episode, I think, that we've done on the perspective, just because
he says that every time, by the way, boys.
I knew he was going to say that.
Which means it's getting better and better.
It's getting
Yes,
better and better.
exactly,
Yes, exactly. But I think, you know, for all the football supporters out there, especially with, you know, teams in the Big Six that have been part of this Super League, they've been caught in this confrontation, whether to go with the more high ground or whether to, you know, go with, you know, the club they've been brought up to love and support. And I think, you know, with the Super League calamity, I am concerned that it may happen again in the future. The proposals may, as you said, Kevin, I am scared for the game. I think a lot of people share my concerns as well. And I mean, Kit underlining the 50+1, the two, you know, interpretations of it in German football. I think we have to, you know, find a way to actually go to that stage and have fan ownership under control, because I think it's going to spiral out of hand if we don't. And I think, you know, if we don't stamp down on, you know, these rich owners coming into our game and, you know, holding so much authority over, you know, the football pyramid, I think it just jeopardizes what we've created throughout the history of football, and it's a massive concern, and one I hope we get control of. But yeah, as I said, thank you so much for both coming on. Make sure you like, share and subscribe, and follow The Perspective on Twitter, and we'll see you again for the next one. Cheers.